Talk Mississippi, streaming at supertalk.fm and SuperTalk TV. Thanks for being with us. All guests appear on the Farm Bureau guest line. Check out favorites.com and go with the home team at Mississippi Farm Bureau. Cole Cubelic joins us right now. Busy guy. Radio show in Birmingham on Jocks. You know him from the SEC Network, sideline analyst. He's dipped into some action lately as well as a booth analyst, which, by the way, is where Michael Borky thinks you should be all the time. I mean, no disrespect to Jordan. He just thinks that that's where you should be on Saturday nights. So, but you have a really interesting perspective, the spot that you're able to watch games. So let's just jump right in. And I want to rewind a couple of weeks to that Ole Miss Texas A&M game to start things. You saw Quinshon Judkins up close and personal. You watched that Ole Miss offensive line. They at times have had issues protecting Jackson Dart, but they seem to not be having issues in terms of opening holes in the run game. What do you see from kind of that group and also Judkins?
I think they've been a group that has played well this year. Now, the protection part of it is real. They've had some breakdowns there. I think it's gotten better as the season has progressed. They do such a good job of just giving you different things visually to be responsible for on offense that it makes playing the run very difficult. But then they have a pretty good offensive line to go along with that, and elite backs, especially Judkins, a guy that he has an innate ability of pressing the line of scrimmage, pressing his blocks, riding his blocks. He's very patient. He's got good vision and just a good understanding of how plays are going to turn out. And at that age, you don't really get that a whole lot. You usually get guys that just get the ball and go 100 miles an hour north and south. And he has the ability to sort of wait and then not get to full speed until he wants to get north and south. He's got a good amount of power to go with really good speed. He's one of those backs to me when I watch him, Richard. He never looks like he's going full speed. Like he never looks like he's trying 100%, but he is. And he makes it look easy. And, they've made some changes up front. I think Jake Thornton's done a good job with that group of moving, Nick Broker down inside. And, they've battled some guys that have been less than 100%. But I think that, and then too, I think not having Trigg the last couple of games has actually worked against them as well. That's a position that offense really relies upon for mismatches and having you defend things a certain way, and not having that's worked against it. But they force you visually to be out of place all the time, and they make you defend all parts of the field. And if you don't, they're going to take advantage of it. So
who's a good comp?
I think it's one of the most unique run schemes in college football. I really do, just with everything they add to it.
Who's a good comp for Judkins? Another back that you've seen that he reminds you of or reminds you of him?
Probably like a TJ Yeldon at Alabama. He's just kind of high waisted, and like I said, just never feels like he's overexerting himself. Like, you watch like Darren McFadden, Adrian Peterson, like you could always tell those, like they were just literally looked like they were going to run out of their uniform. But then there's other backs that just never felt, they just look like they glide. And, you go back to like a Gale Sayers and guys like that just felt like they always were just kind of flowing. Judkins kind of reminds me of that. Yeldon was I watched TJ Yeldon play in high school, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I think Judkins kind of in the same mold.
Let's scoot from Oxford to Starkville. That's where you were this past Saturday night. You saw that Mississippi State-Auburn game. Mississippi State at times offensively looks like a well-oiled machine. And then at times they look like, they're two flat tires and the oil needs to be changed. And, they stop running the ball. What's going on with them offensively?
Some of it's inexplicable. And some of it, I don't know. I do think the weather worked against them a little bit. When the rain kind of started coming down, it was kind of dry. It had stopped early, and then it started again. And then the balls get a little bit more wet. The receivers' hands get a little more wet. Things get heavier. I think that played a little bit of a part. But really, it was protection breakdowns that were bad, and it wasn't like Auburn was really overloading, trying to bring 7 or 8 guys at a time. It was just one-on-one losses. Tackles getting their feet together a little bit too much, or opening their hips a little too early, and giving a free lane to the quarterback. And there were a couple of drops, and there were a couple of balls that Will missed. It was collective, but I do think getting away from that run was something that was problematic. When they stuck to that, and it hasn't been consistent, but when they've stuck to that this year, they've been much more difficult to defend, because you can't play 3 down when they do that. And when you can play 3 down and decide when you want to add somebody else, how you want to add somebody else to your pressure packages, that gives you a big advantage on defense. Auburn was playing 4 down to start, and I think they were doing it specifically because they didn't want to get run on. They're not a very heavy front. And so they saw some of the double teams that I saw earlier this year and probably want to try to avoid that. I just think it's one of those offenses that it's so rhythm and timing based that at times it's just going to slow down. And it's a stubborn offense to a certain extent. I mean, Mike Leach believes somebody's open on every play, no matter what. And so, like, I talked to Chris Hatcher at Sanford, and he told me that that's what he used to tell them in their quarterback room. Somebody's open on every play. And there would be times that he'd look at the first read and it was covered, and then the fourth read, and he'd say, why didn't you start over here on the fourth read? He's wide open. And you're just like, but that's the fourth read. So, like I said, some of it is just stubborn in its nature. And so I think, and listen, there are other offenses that are not dissimilar to that. You know, Tennessee's offense is kind of the same way. I mean, they will go and go and go and go and go. And then all of a sudden, it seems like they run into a wall, and you'll get 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out. Again, timing, rhythm based. Tempo. You got to have that first down to get things going. So I think a lot of offenses that are reliant on that, and that's a big part of how they have success. There's going to be times that it just kind of goes away. And I think the coaching and the experience comes in when how do you get it back? And that's the difficult part.
So we're not there yet, right? We're still 2.5 weeks away from the Egg Bowl. But when you look at these two teams, Ole Miss and what they do offensively, Mississippi State, pretty good on the defensive side, kind of what they do offensively. I mean, not who do you think is going to win the game, but what's going to be important in that matchup?
Well, I think the first thing is, athletically, Mississippi State does not have a lot of advantage defensively. They have advantages in a lot of other places. Like, I mean, they can come to the line of scrimmage and knock you back. And physically they can go toe to toe with just about anybody. But on the perimeter, things are a little bit different. And just running with teams, it's a little bit different. So that would be a big concern for me is, does Zach Arnett decide to play different personnel, maybe a little bit of a different lineup to sort of match the speed and athleticism that Ole Miss is going to bring to the table, especially if they continue doing things like playing Mingo at sort of that H tight end position where, and here's the thing, they haven't used him out of that very much. You've seen him kind of block some people and do some different things, but I mean, what's going to happen when all of a sudden they just run him up the seam? Like who's going to match up with that? I'm not just talking about Mississippi State. I'm talking about anybody. Like there's a lot of creative things that they're going to be able to do if he keeps playing in that spot some that I don't think anybody else is going to be able to match up with. So speed and athleticism on the perimeter would be the first thing that I'll be concerned about. And then it goes back to what we were just talking about. Ole Miss, we talk about Auburn not being a heavy front. Ole Miss is a very light front just in their nature. And if Mississippi State if they get the right looks and they decide, okay, we're just going to run the ball and we'll focus on our double teams and try to get movement, they should be able to do that. If they're getting 3 down and 4 in the box and maybe 5 in the box, they should be able to have success with that. But you have to stay with it and you have to stay committed to it. So if they stay committed to it and they get those looks, I think they can find some success.
I know you're tight on time. I appreciate you spending a few minutes with us. So anytime there's a head coach opening in the SEC, everybody that's in the SEC focuses on that, especially when it happens with a month left in the season. All the more so when the quote-unquote leading candidate is the head coach of one of the schools in Mississippi. What do you make of the Lane Kiffin Auburn thing, and maybe bigger picture? I know you guys are talking about it a ton on the radio. Just the Auburn opening and where this thing is headed. Is there traction in the search? What's going on?
I think the interest from Lane's perspective, at least from the Auburn side, is real. I think that his camp has listened and has, probably had a few conversations. I know he's a target, and I mean, I've said it publicly. I think he would be best case scenario for Auburn. That's just my opinion. I think this time around, Auburn needs to do more to excite the fan base, to gain energy for, you go back to when Ole Miss and Mississippi State made those 2 hires. I didn't think things were as bad internally as a lot of other people did. And so I think a lot of the reason that you made those hires were to energize fan bases that maybe weren't as excited about things. And at the time I was kind of like, really? I mean, is that where we are? And yes, to answer my own question, that's where we are now. And from an NIL perspective, just from a transfer portal perspective, I think you have to have some juice when it comes to who your coach is and why kids are paying attention to it and why it's fun and why it's familiar and why there's some notoriety. So this can't be a Tommy Tuberville, Terry Bowden, Gene Chizik hire. And that's nothing against any of those. They all had success. I mean, Chizik won a national championship. You know, Tuberville had undefeated seasons. We went to the SEC championship game in his second season. So all those guys had success. Like Gus went to the national championship game in his first year, won an SEC championship. But those guys weren't ones that you were going to put their names on billboards and it was going to wow people. I think Auburn needs a little bit of that this time around. I really do. And just because they've got to flip that roster in a hurry. Is not a talented group. And they've got to find some momentum that will help them do that. And bringing in someone who is a program builder or is going to offer, you know, maybe some sustainability moving forward. I don't know if that's enough right now based on what Alabama is doing, what Georgia's doing, and then what a lot of other teams in the league seem like they're doing. So, you know, I don't think the Dan Lanning stuff is very real. I don't believe Matt Rule would take it. That's just my opinion. I know Matt, and it doesn't seem like his thing. But I mean, what's the money going to look like? It could be a situation where, you know, when the salary is presented and that gets thrown around in the agent world, that all of a sudden more people become interested and think it'd be a great hire. You know, what are John Cohen's relationships like, where he could maybe, someone who wasn't interested said, oh, well, if that's going to be the guy in the office with me every day, I might be interested now. We don't really know the answer to all those questions. So I think there's a lot that's going to go into it. Yeah, I think there are a couple of guys whose name is real and they're being discussed, but there's always those, you know this, Richard, there's always those 2 or 3 names that none of us are ever thinking about, that none of us are ever talking about, kind of like Brian Harsin, that end up being real candidates and we have to pay attention to and sometimes end up getting the job.
What do you do with Hugh Freeze in this search?
I think you vet him and you talk about it. I mean, he could come to Auburn and win. I have no doubts about that.
Yeah.
You know, so that's a decision that some people internally are going to have to make. Is, you know, there will always be another side of that is going to have to be dealt with and answered to, and that's not necessarily just from Hugh. That's from the administrative standpoint. Listen, I'm not somebody who sits here and says, oh, somebody made a mistake 8 years ago, they should never get another job. That's not me. I'd be beyond hypocritical if that were me. But, you know, we know what's going to come with it. And, you know, there's a lot that would have to be dealt with. And so I don't know what the folks behind the scenes think about those things because we haven't had those conversations. But if you're asking me if Hugh Freeze could come to Auburn and win, yeah, absolutely.
I know you got to go. The last thing I'll ask you, and we'll be done. How much autonomy does John Cohen have in this? Is it input from other people that matter? Is it he gets to do it all by himself? How does that work?
I think he could do it by himself if he wanted to, but I think he would be foolish to. And from what I have already heard from him, read about him, and heard from people around him, I think he has a pretty good understanding that it would be in everyone's best interest if this was somewhat of a collective decision. Now, it's still his decision, but he understands, I'm sure, that his predecessor went out and could have made a decision collectively and decided not to and saw how that went. He's no longer there. That coach is no longer there. So I think that because of him being sort of around it for a while, he'll probably understand that people should be involved and people should be heard, but this still needs to be a decision that's best for Auburn as far as who they're actually able to go get.
Great stuff, Cole.